All right, so welcome again to the Internet of Water Peer-to-Peer Network webinar series. Today we have a presentation by the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation about their interactive story map that they made to promote and highlight the importance of Montana's robust stream gauge network and the role that the gauges play in managing Montana's water resources. So my name is Lucas Stevens. I'm a policy associate at the Internet of Water project at Duke University, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. In just a moment, I'll turn it over to our presenters from the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, Paul Azevedo, Nikki Sanvi, and Joel Harris, who will be telling us about their project to promote the critical data that stream gauges provide in Montana. Some of these gauges have been measuring stream flow and other parameters for decades, but the way that that information is shared and used has changed a lot in the past few years. And so they created this story map to go over some of the details of those management aspects of the stream gauges. First, I want to go over just a couple of housekeeping details. So we are recording the webinar today. And the recording, as well as the slides, the presentation slides, will be available on our website following the presentation, and we'll get those up soon. So if you have to leave early for some reason, or your internet connection cuts out unexpectedly or something, don't worry. You will be able to find the presentation on the internet later. And then at the end of the presentation today, we'll have some time for Q&A. So at any time a question pops into your head, don't hesitate to put it in the Q&A box, and I will read it out following the presentation and moderate the discussion. If you have any administrative issues, like the sound cuts out or the video stops working or something like that, you can put those in the chat box, and we'll try to get those fixed during the presentation. Okay, and with that, I will stop sharing and hand it over to the team from Montana.
Okay, thank you, Lucas. And Joel, if you want to get sharing there. Okay, first off, Lucas and David, thank you for inviting us to participate in this webinar today and share a product that we've worked on here in Montana. I've sat in on several of your webinars in the past. Never thought I'd actually get to be a part of one, so appreciate that opportunity. As Lucas said, I'm Paul Azevedo. I'm the Bureau Chief of the Water Management Bureau at Montana DNRC. I've been with the department going on 23 years now. With me today is Nikki Sanvi and Joel Harris, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a little bit. But to get started here, we're going to start out with two poll questions, kind of just to test your general knowledge of Montana. So if you want to throw those poll questions up. So the first question is, how many states and provinces does Montana border? And then how many oceans does water in Montana drain to? So if people want to take a shot at that, and then I will pause and people can take a chance to answer the poll. And so again, how many states and provinces do we border, and how many oceans does water in Montana drain to? Your test of general geography knowledge. Do we have any results? Okay, there we go. So the first one, 15% got it right. Actually, Montana shares borders between the state and provinces. The answer is 7. Along the northern border, we share with British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and then our surrounding states are Idaho, Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And actually, we shared trans-border waters with all 7 of those. And then how many oceans does Montana water drain to? The correct answer is 3. So west of the divide, which divides our state, that's part of the Columbia River drainage, flows to the Pacific. On the east of the divide is the Missouri River drainage, which flows to the Mississippi and then Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic. And then actually there's a little slice of land up on the Blackfeet Reservation, the St. Mary's drainage, which actually flows north into Alberta, joins the Old Man River, eventually joins the Saskatchewan River, and then finally ends up in the Hudson Bay drainage, which is part of the Arctic Ocean. So there's a peak up there called Triple Divide Peak. If you poured water on top of that peak, it could go in all three directions. So I'm gonna close that. As I was saying, so our StoryMap is one of three products we have, also working on educational videos, which is to increase the fluency about stream gauges and actually how they work and what's inside the box and what it actually takes to get that information from gauge to page. And then recently released our Stream and Gauge Explorer. That's a mobile-friendly application that delivers real-time stream flow data to your computer or your mobile device. And our Stage application is actually hooked up. We built it to deliver information that's collected from a network of 40 gauges that are owned and operated by the Department of Natural Resources. So those 40 are an additional to the USGS gauge system, which we're going to talk about here shortly. So next slide, please. So in Montana, we have a network of approximately 220 USGS gauges. These are year-round seasonal real-time gauges. Like every other state in the nation, water managers and water users in Montana rely on the information provided by this network, use it for water rights administration, monitoring flood and drought conditions, making operational decisions, reservoir operations, and guiding water planning. When you think about it, it's really an amazing system that you've got all these gauges out there working, some of them in very, very remote locations, collecting stream flow information, beaming it to a satellite, and then suddenly, like magic, it ends up on your phone or your computer. Happens 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You never have to think about it. It's just there. And the most amazing thing is it's all free. And I use free in quotes because those who are part of this webinar who know stream gauging know that it's not free. It's really quite expensive. And there's an entire network of people and equipment and computer systems out there managing all of this in the background. And it does take quite a bit of money to keep that system operating. So the genesis of the StoryMap that we produce goes back to 2018, when Montana faced the prospect of losing 10 of those stream gauges, basically for lack of O&M funding, the inability to fund them to keep operating. So before we got another poll question here. David, if you could pop that up, please. So the question is, who funds the gauges? And this question is really more Montana specific, but you could also think of it from your own state if you know who funds the gauges in your own state. Okay, we got results from that coming in. Well, I'm not seeing any results yet. So, oh, there we go. And actually, G is correct. So 65% of the respondents got that answer correct. At least in Montana, that's the way it works. So next slide, please. So in Montana, there's actually a network of about 23 different partners that are providing O&M funding to USGS for the system. On the state side, DNRC, we're the largest partner, currently providing O&M funding to 43 different gauges. It's costing me this year about $312,000 to support those 43 gauges. Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is close behind us at 20 gauges, but they also provide funding support for 25 gauges for just the temperature portion versus the flow portion. And then our Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology, Department of Environmental Quality, and Montana Department of Transportation. Next slide, please. So in 2018, when news got out that we might lose 10 of those gauges, it really caught a lot of people by surprise. There's a number of water user groups out there that are in the basins where those gauges would potentially be discontinued. I mean, they depended on that information for monitoring, for cooperatively managing their local water resource plans. And to suddenly find out that that gauge would be potentially going off in a couple of weeks really left them scrambling to try to find an alternative. And they were rightly upset. It came as a surprise. Phone calls were made. I know USGS got phone calls. I received phone calls, and elected officials in Montana received phone calls. And they had good questions. It's like, why is this gauge going off? Why in our particular basin? And who made this decision? And why weren't we consulted? And before moving on, I got one more, if you could put up the next poll. And one of the things they were really scrambling to find was funding to keep that gauge operating. So the question is, what do you think it costs to maintain a USGS gauge? So up there is kind of a range of numbers for going from a 6-month gauge out to a year-round gauge, which is about $18,000. So is that less than you thought, about what you thought, or more than what you thought it cost? Okay, David, if you got, let's see where people are. Yep, well, 50%. That's got that right. That's about what it costs. Currently, it obviously inflation affects everything, and the cost is going up. But right now, it's about $18,360 for a year-round gauge. So that, Joel, next slide, please. So that 2018 event, it revealed numerous things for us. One is this mismatch between the water users' expectations that information was going to be available to them all the time. And so kind of a mismatch between expectations that the information would be there and an understanding of how the system's actually monitor, or how the system actually works, what it costs to run the system, who actually pays the bills, and who manages it all. And it also showed a lack of information and information sharing and coordination, and that not only between the funding partners who are each out there making annual decisions on how much they can fund individually, but also, and from the DNRC perspective, going back to that question that they had of why weren't we consulted? In 2018, I wouldn't have even known who to call and who to talk with about a particular gauge in a basin, because you don't know who's actually depending on a gauge until it goes dark, and then you find out who depends on it. So it was a real wake-up call to us, that is the state agency that's most heavily invested in the USGS system, that we needed to do a better job of providing information to the public and to elected officials on why that network is so important to Montana, what it actually takes to get that data going from the gauge to the page, and that although it is expensive, it's also value. It provides real benefit to us. And so the story map we put together is just one part of that effort to get that message out. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joel. And Joel is the guy kind of behind the curtain. When we were first putting this idea together, I went to Joel and I said, I've got this idea. This is what I want to do. Can you make it happen? And so Joel, I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And thanks, Internet of Water. Can everybody hear me okay? Good, okay. All righty, well, yeah, I'm Joel Harris, also with Montana DNRC, excited to be presenting a little bit of our work on the StoryMap today. My role, as Paul mentioned, in building this, helping build this StoryMap was mostly focused on kind of the back end, under the hood technical work of putting it together. This involved developing, the GIS feature class for the USGS stream gauges, the points layer, putting together a couple Esri web maps and web map applications, and then of course putting all this together into the StoryMap application itself. So I do want to stress most of the credit for this should go to Paul and Nikki, but yeah, I'm going to be talking about the kind of nuts and bolts of it a little bit. But before I get started on that front, I did want to start off with a poll of the audience today. I know we're doing a lot of polls. I want to get an idea of how familiar you all are with story maps. So there it is. Thanks, David. Take a sec to answer that question there. All righty, results. Let's see. Never heard of them, about a third. Know what they are. 16%. I've seen many of them, 25%. And then we've got about a third of people that actually have been involved in building these. So a good spread of folks. So that helps me, know how technical I want to get here. A lot of people are pretty new to these. So thanks for that information. Let's see. So really starting off with a kind of a working definition for folks that are new to these. And I don't know how many of you have had a chance to actually look at our story map. We will tour it a little bit later, but story maps really are pretty simple and easy to work with. If you have some basic familiarity with other ArcGIS software, ArcDesktop, ArcMap, ArcPro, you can really use that to utilize existing layers, develop new layers for background maps that really are easy to plug into these. So a little experience to begin with goes a long way with these. A story map, to give you a little definition, it's according to Esri, is a web-based application that enables you to share your maps in the context of narrative text and other multimedia content. So basically a simple website template, that easily integrates text, which helps you give context to your story. You can put, of course, the Arc maps in there, interactive maps, kind of like Google Maps that you can zoom into and out of and click on things in. You can get photos, videos, sliders, other tools, other media in there. So like I said, we're going to do a tour of ours, but I am just going to get a little technical for a minute here. So here is basically our workflow to our process for creating this story map. We began with an Excel table, kind of a boring table that had all of the information in it, the gauges, the GPS coordinates for where those are located, the folks, the entities involved in funding, the streams being measured, just all the information. And we took this table, and the goal, of course, was to put it in a format that was more engaging, more visually interesting. StoryMap was a good, is a great option there. So we use this table, to begin with to build our stream gauge points. Believe it or not, we actually didn't already have a comprehensive list of these in GIS form. So we went through that effort. From here, we uploaded the points layer to a map service on our DNRC web server that allows easy integration into web maps. From there, having some web maps, we created a couple web map applications, not to get too technical here, but basically those allow you to utilize kind of a suite of tools that these applications have. Web App Builder is one of these applications we used. You can, in what we were, we also picked some other layers to get into these web maps, of things like state boundary and county, Indian reservation boundaries, water basin boundaries, NHD streamlines, base maps. Like I said, these web maps are then housed in an application. And of course, aside from all this technical stuff, there was the text and the photos and the other content that we put together in the StoryMap template itself, which is pretty easy to work with. There was an update to Esri story maps a couple of years ago where they kind of revamped. They used to have a whole bunch of different templates to work with, and that was kind of fun in itself. But their new story map, I think it was written on a new code as well, so it was faster, but it was just a lot easier. It's basically there isn't as many options for templates, but they're all really easy to work with and seem to work better on phones. And we did use one of the new templates. And Paul did mention we're going to have some time for Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions about our kind of under the hood background process here, maybe type those in the Q&A or hold on to those for the end. We did spend some time, of course, on making some touches, to try to make this pretty, make this more engaging. One of the things we did, and you'll see when we give the tour, is we created these, or we utilized these stream footprint reaches. So if you look at the slide here, there's that shape of the river. That is actually a Montana river. The Natural Heritage Program with Montana State Library puts these footprints together. Of course, it's a lot prettier than an NHD line. It's not just a line. It has the islands. It has various thickness of the river. You just get more of a feel. We used these stream reaches as sort of transitions between parts of our story map. So you scroll down in the story map from one part to another, and you get kind of this meandering Montana stream. One of the touches we used there, photos is another. We've spent a lot of time getting pretty appropriate historical photos. Nikki's going to talk more in depth on these, but I will say that the gauges themselves, which are at the center of the story, they're mostly very uninteresting to look at themselves, right? So we kind of focused on photos of the rivers being measured, of people doing measuring, of people enjoying the streams, or of extreme conditions like floods or ice jams, where water management, of course, is very important. Finally, some tools. I mentioned the web applications allow you to pick from a variety of tools, and I think I'll just save that part for the demo part of this presentation. So stay tuned there. Finally, I wanted to mention the importance of putting all these things together in a way that flows, right? In a way that tells the story in a sequence, keeps people interested, intersperses an appropriate amount of technical and contextual information about Montana gauges, photos, and other resources for folks that want to dive deeper. Montanans do have a reputation for having a close connection to their rivers. And this was one of the things that was important for us to highlight, the unique cultural piece. Montana is a big state, a lot of rivers run through it. So an exciting project to work on. But yeah, thanks for bearing with me on the nuts and bolts side of the project. I'm going to turn it over to Nikki now to do her part.
Thanks, Joel. I am Nikki Sandvey, and at some point you might be able to see my face. Maybe you can already. I am the Water Education Coordinator for the Water Management Bureau. And Paul approached me in this project and said, hey, can you put together some of the story pieces? So initially, we were thinking that that information would be like a single gauge. We would talk about a single gauge and then focus on that for the different stories. I went initially to the water planners and some other people and said, hey, what are some of the gauges that we want to focus on? With Montana being the 4th largest state in the nation, we really wanted to, sometimes the western side gets a little bit more publicity, it's more populous and things, but I wanted to make sure we were focusing also on gauges from across the state. So we made sure to get some eastern ones in. As we were talking about it, Paul made some initial choices, but we also wanted to make sure that the gauges were funded by state, federal, and local agencies. So kind of having a spread of that information, highlighting their different uses, was it's around flooding issues or temperature issues or things like that was really important. And then, like I said, highlighting the gauges across the state. Joel, can you get the next slide? So initially we sent out emails to the people that we knew relied on some of these gauges. Some of these folks had been in the meetings when Paul talked about that there had been a lot of challenges and people were surprised that the gauges went off. And so we approached some of those folks and said, hey, we'd like to tell a story about some of these gauges. And I initially went in saying, hey, we're going to try to focus on one gauge. And really what happened as we were gathering stories is the richness of the stories came out as people came back and said things like asking the Mussel Shell Coalition to pick a favorite gauge that they rely on as an impossible task. And trying to pick things that are more critical than others, it's just too hard to do. And then one of my favorite stories on that was also looking at the hydrologists when they see a problem coming with the discharge. So they're watching the discharges 24/7 up, and they're just before you go into Fort Peck. And so if you look at a Montana map, it's on the eastern third, it's on one of those areas. And so they would have to send a deputy to a campground in the middle of the night because the water could go up that high. They say that happens about every other year. Sometimes it happens annually, not always in the middle of the night, but they then contact the Fergus County Sheriff's Office because where you go into there's no cell service because you're below any of the prairie, you drop down into the river area. And they had some interesting pictures for us on that. So it was really unique to kind of get some of these interviews. I did about 200 emails back and forth between people, refining stories, having them look at what we'd taken from their information. And the richest piece in that was really to look at the interview part. Once I talked on the phone to quite a few people, that piece helped me a lot. Oftentimes I just threw a Word document open and I just started typing as they were talking. So I've done that before and that helped us with really creating some of that richness for the stories. Next slide, Joel, thanks. So one of the things that came up is we have a hydrologist who's recently retired, Mike Roberts, and he talked to us a little bit about some gauges in the Big Hole. They tend to get decent amount of coverage here in Montana because they have a really great story. And then Mike was like, so what else are you doing? And I said, oh, I'm also looking at the North Fork of the Blackfoot. And he said, oh, that is so cool. And this is when I was really happy there was a Word document open, because he started talking about the geology and hydrology of how that river worked and how it was such an important place to put that gauge, after it flows out of the mountains on a flat on a glacial wash plain. And when I am ever working on this thing, I'm always trying to figure out how can we access the best information to get to the most people that maybe aren't science people, so that they'll understand it in plain language. And so I was walking in the evening and the idea of kind of a Google Earth map came up. And so I took a look at that and thought about, like, could we do Google Earth? And so I approached Joel and he made the magic happen on this map. So I said, we really need that to show kind of what happens with the river. How does it come out of the mountains? Why does it go around that glacial, sorry, I just lost the glacial outwash plain, and why that's important to put a gauge there versus even just closer to the road where there's a bridge and things like that. So it's critical information for the irrigators. It's also in that area, critical information for bull trout migration and spawning. Next slide, Joel. So some of the slides, you know, I jokingly, because I looked at, as Joel mentioned, they're not really pretty things to look at, our gauge stations. I kind of call them high security outhouses with some Wi-Fi connection. And I think the general public might think that's what they are. There's a part of me that worries that we're going to focus on them and people are going to know and maybe do something to them. We haven't had that issue. I had a gentleman here at DNRC say, Nikki, in some ways we'd be so excited that people actually kind of knew what they were. So don't worry about it. I don't think that crowd's going to be looking at your webinar. So we started highlighting a little bit more of those pieces. So the Sun River Watershed Group, that's the one. It's not a pretty river in that section. And it's one of those things that it's like, okay, let's just show the outhouse then. So that's it. We got the outhouse there, the high Wi-Fi outhouse. It's a really important watershed piece. This one in particular that we focused on had a long data set. And I think 82 years is what we say in the story. If the story's right, I could be wrong. So we got another from the National Weather Service. This is that road that goes down to that campground, and you can see how the river, when it hits high floodwaters, can be an issue. They have had an instance where a couple of people had put their campers down there and then they'd gone home and for the night for whatever reason, and so their campers ended up getting flooded. And if you know springs in Montana, things freeze, and so they've had some campers wash out also. That was not a picture we chose because I felt like something on the bottom right is a better story about some of our ice washes and things that happen in breakup season here. So I was pretty happy to see some really great photos coming in. The one on the upper right is 1988 and the big hole. It's a picture that more than likely sat in somebody's box somewhere or maybe in a file in their work office. It wasn't ideal. I'm pretty sure they took their 1988 photo and scanned it, but it's one of the better ones to show what the big hole looked like in 1988 when it ran dry. And they've been having that issue a lot. Jim McGee was another great, he was recently retired from USFWS, and he was just really a great storyteller, talking about how that was important. And he was the one that sent me some PowerPoints, and I pulled the photos off of those. So although I don't think we'll make it on Life magazine when I need this, I thought it was important to use the quality that we got and the story and words from people that we were able to talk to them about and get some of their language. The funniest thing if you do this is that I sent all of my language back to the participants that were in this. And I was like, okay, here's the deal. And they would edit their own language, which I'm like, okay, whatever. We all type emails fast, it works. We just kind of ran with their edits as long as they approved it. Next slide, Joel. So one of the things early on, I was thinking, okay, what's in it? These organizations are small nonprofits. They're working on small grants. How do we make it something that's useful for them also? So I committed that within this process that we would have a link directly to the Gage, and Joel will show you how that works when he does the tour. And then I also wanted to make sure to highlight those nonprofits. One of the things we heard when the things got turned off was that that a small nonprofit like a watershed coalition can't always gather $10,000 in 60 days to be able to help keep a gauge funded, even though that gauge is super important. That they need to have some front end on that, and they need to continually be educating their donors and their people that participate with all of their fundraisers and things like that. That is such an important thing. And so I don't know how many times those have been clicked, but my hope was that if somebody saw Gage in a story and they thought it was important, that maybe they'd get involved with that group, and maybe in the future they'd become a donor for that group, and that would help keep those gauges going that were really important for those groups. We also created some resources at the end of the map. One of them was we, like USGS, spell Gage, G-A-G-E. Notoriously, when I stick anything like that up on social media, we have somebody come back, say, you know, you got your spelling wrong. And so we link to why it's spelled like that. We also have some other resource links that are a little bit more technical in case people are interested in that. And so it was really important to kind of, again, for me, I'm always looking at, I want to go from the scientist to the person that may just have moved to the state and doesn't understand how important gauges are to managing our water and the important process that we have going on here. And then I just want to point out the photo that's on the screen also. That actually is, Chris Boyer does some great conservation photos, but the Mussel Shell hired him to do that piece. That flood actually took out one of the gauges that they have since rebuilt, so they can continue with their data set on that. But it talks a lot about how that river has been, I mean, since I've been working at DNRC for 8 or 9 years now, we've had multiple floods going through that area. So I just thought it was a really nice way to show some of the velocity that rivers can create, because I think some people think about that and think about waters in June and July where they're easier to row and things like that. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joel, and he is going to give us a map tour, so you get to see some of those pieces.
Alrighty, give me just a sec here. I'm gonna get out of the PowerPoint for a sec. All right, can everybody see the screen? Yep. Great, and I'm gonna be looking this way because I have it on my other screen here. Anyhow, that might have been interesting for folks that hadn't seen a story map before to hear us describe it in detail. And so here we go. This is a story map. Landing page here. You scroll down to go further in the story. And I mentioned having some kind of Montana river shapes as transitions. That's our first one. The Mussel Shell River also, which Nikki just mentioned. Yeah, and this is just a little introduction, some context for why we think this story is important to tell, the story of, you know, who funds these gauges, the different partnerships that make these happen, and why it's important to have this network of gauges. Just continue on here. Here's one of our trusty hydrologists out with a flow tracker, taking a measurement in the cold, it looks like. And we've talked a lot about, yeah, we have these, part of the story are these profiles of specific gauges. Here's the gauge number, the first one. We do Muddy Creek gauge. We kind of dive into why this gauge is important, you know, kind of the specifics of this gauge. The Sun River Watershed Group is kind of the, you know, the entity, one of the partners involved in funding that gauge. Finally, here's our first web map. And this one shows all the gauges, you know, all the gauges that measure discharge, so just size of the river at any given time. And it's an interactive map, so you can zoom in, click on some of these. So I'll click on this one. This is the Teton River below South Fork near Choteau, Montana. You know, and you go down a little further, there's a link to the actual USGS page, real-time information page for that gauge. And then kind of our story, you know, emphasis here is this information. You can see who funds this gauge. You know, it's a cooperative gauge. It's a cooperation of Montana DNRC, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, you know, the Teton Conservation District, also USGS. So there's a lot of partners that, for whom this gauge is important for managing, for agriculture, for fish, for whatever it is. I'll just move over to another one. Let's look at this one on the Flathead Reservation. South Crow Creek near Ronan Gage. Again, here's the link to the USGS page. Here's the funders. Again, it's cooperative, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes that live on the reservation there. They're part of funding this gauge along with USGS. So that's another partnership.
Could you explain the colors, Joel?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Question.
So here's a legend right here. And yeah, that's the very basics. These colors are, chosen to show the different funders, the different funding entities. So the blue squares are cooperatively funded gauges. These red circles, federally funded. Green stars, privately funded. So yeah, it just gives you an idea just looking at them, who funds them, whether it's cooperative arrangement, going over to the northeast part of the state, click on one here. This is on the Fort Peck Reservation, the Poplar River near Poplar, Montana. This is a cooperative funding between the Fort Peck tribes and USGS. So another team effort there. Just a little more on the map itself. There's a tool here that, got the layer list. You can turn things on and off, based on what you might want to see. Maybe you don't want to see the reservations, or maybe you want to see the conservation district boundaries. That could be interesting. So a little customization is available. We have a filter on this too, because maybe you're just interested in the federal gauges. You can just look at those, just look at the private, turn that back off and look at them all. Select a base map. These are the tools I was mentioning in a web application. In this case, it's a web app builder that I use to include some tools in the web map. This last one is the attribute table. So it's got all the information on these gauges. You can export this to a spreadsheet if you really want to nerd out on it. But yeah, the further you zoom in, the more layers that start to show up, like these water basin boundaries. Here's the Judith. Go in a little further and you have some more detailed NHD, kind of flow information. Hit the home button and you're back out. So that's our first map. I'll just keep going here. Yeah, isn't that a striking photo? Kind of an ice jam in the making there, or one that had broken loose. This is a gauge, another gauge profile on the Missouri River. You can dive into that if you want to. I think David's family is probably close to, or was close to this gauge here. Let's keep scrolling. I hope people aren't getting dizzy here. All right, our second web map here. This one focuses on the gauges that measure temperature. So you can see there's less of these. FWP, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is really interested in these, but so are other entities like DNRC and USGS. Clark Fork River at Superior. This is a cooperative between FWP, USGS. There is some overlap too between the discharge gauges I showed first and these. There are some that show that measure both. But aside from different emphasis, the map is very similar. It has the same tools. Just designed for folks used to Google Earth and zooming in and hopefully showing some data in a kind of an intuitive way. Here's one of our transitions that has a little reservoir in it. This is on Big Sandy Creek. Sandy Creek up near the fort, or up near the Rocky Boys Reservation in north central Montana. Nikki talked about this gauge being just super interesting for fish management purposes. Bull trout, or trying to think of the word, is it protected, not quite endangered species, but a species of concern. They spawn on the North Fork here, and it's of course an interesting geological situation there, how it comes out of the mountains onto that Kleinschmidt Flat, glacial outwash there. I'll just continue on for sake of time. Oh, this is actually my uncle. My uncle Merritt is a fishing guide on the Bighorn River. It's kind of a fun photo. He must have had a client here fishing in the corral, is what they call this fishing hole on the Bighorn. And oftentimes horses will come down, and this one obviously was curious what was going on here. So I got a good photo there. Of course, a little information here about the importance of the FWP temperature gauges for fish and wildlife management. Sometimes they have to put in hoodell closures, right? When it gets too hot and the water gets too low, they restrict, how many hours you can fish the river, just to give the, less stress on the fish. All right, back down here to the big hole gauge. This one is a good example. The photos here of, not the best photos, but it shows, the one on the left is 1988. The one on the right is from 2018. You can see on the left, it's very low. And, just to highlight the importance of this and other gauges on the big hole, there was a lot that happened on the big hole, including a lot of measurement, that happened between these two time periods that have allowed, water managers to keep more water in the stream. So in 2018, you can see there's more. Ranchers are still getting their water, and there's actually Arctic grayling, which is another endangered species that are in the big hole. And it's, you'd imagine it's good for those fish to keep more water in the stream, keep things cooler. So just another story highlighting the importance of managing and measuring these streams with our network. But we are wrapping up here. We have a little thank you and some resources at the end, but that is it for the tour. I think I'll turn it back to Nikki for some hindsights. I'm going to put the PowerPoint back up.
Yeah, initially we kind of went into this a little bit blind. I think for me, going back, if somebody said do it again, I would try to go into the stories with much more of an open mind. I would maybe, especially because people are used to Zoom and things like that now, try for audio and video interviews. That would require more time editing in the end, but it might be a nice thing to add into a story map. What I learned, we had a couple areas we needed photos, and so hydrologists were going out and they took some. And I think what you need to, for me, I would send them with a sticky note that says, take a lot of photos and then take some more. And so from every angle, take lots of different angles, because sometimes the lighting shows up differently once you start working through the system. And it was a really great piece of information. An award-winning photographer for the Associated Press told me, she said, and this is in the film days, she said, take a lot of pictures and then take some more and you'll always get good ones. And then I'm just going to go to the last one on, then Joel can go back, but some of that we wanted to for this talk about our Google Analytics and found out that our map wasn't hooked up to Google Analytics yet. So when you're working with your IT team and you get it posted, try to get that hooked up right away so you have a sense of when people are looking at it or who is in general, and then decide how your promotions might work on that, on the map, and just looking at the funding and things for these gauges. And then Joel had something about creating the map.
Yeah, I just had a quick technical hindsight 2020. I mentioned we started with, I think actually we had several layers that had points, right? And none of them were up to date. None of them were comprehensive. So I spent a ton of time at the beginning of this project kind of trying to reconcile different point layers. And in hindsight, it would have been way smarter and easier to just start from scratch, to just take that table that has the GPS points, that's comprehensive, and it's really easy on ArcMap. You just do like a point, let's see, GPS, I think it's XY to points tool. Just hit that button and it creates all those points for you. And that would have been way easier than, wasting all that time reconciling tables. But that was, yep, that's my last hindsight there. So I think we'll turn it back over to Lucas.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much. So I just want to say I found that really interesting. And when I first read through the story map, I too, I found the Blackfoot River example really interesting. I really liked the story about balancing like fish passage with irrigation. And then in the satellite photo, you could see the topography change. You could see the glacial valley. You could see the center pivot irrigation, right? Right there. So it really helps tell that story. I thought that was really interesting. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. So if possible, could you tell us a bit more about the water planning in Montana? How many years are you planning into the future? And do you consider climate change when you estimate the future water supply?
Oh, I guess I will take that one. So we'd updated Montana State Water Plan in 2015. By statute, we need to update it every 20 years. I personally wish we would do it more than that. We should be doing it every 5 years. The plan that we did, taking climate change into account, we felt lucky just to be able to talk about the subject of climate change in 2015 without causing too much of a stir. So that particular water plan does not talk about climate change too much. We are now in the process of updating our drought plan, which hasn't been updated since the 90s. And that one will climate change will be a subject in that, and it will be addressed in the drought plan, although it was not in the water plan.
And then we got a comment about, okay, so USGS has apparently produced a map that rates or ranks gauge stations across the country based on certain criteria they developed, which I think one of the criteria seems to be the length of the record a gauge has. So do you all know about this ranking, and have you considered?
I think what's being addressed there is on Joel's map. There was the category of federal priority gauges, and those are gauges that are fully funded by the USGS because they meet certain federal priorities. So they do go through, and there's 5 or 6 criteria that a gauge has to meet in order to get put on the federal priority list. So that's maybe what that question is addressing. And my understanding is actually USGS is going to go back and start looking at those federal priorities and see if the criteria are still applicable for today and how they might change things around. So I understand they're kind of taking a look at that program and seeing if the priorities are still correct, if they should come up with different ways of doing it. So.
And then we got another comment. So in New Mexico, they gauge their diversions as well. Does Montana gauge diversions?
Not as a matter. On some we do, but not as a matter of course. Managing water in Montana is very, very different. It's very there is not a lot of openness to a state agency coming onto an irrigation district and measuring the diversions. Some do, some don't. There's no requirement that it be done. We work with irrigation districts, measuring some of it. When we are working with irrigation districts, measuring diversions, it's usually in helping a basin put together a drought management plan, or we might be working with that irrigation district itself in helping them understand their water use so that they can make improvements to improve their own water management. But gauging diversions is not a matter of course up here.
And then, so we got a quick question about how to access the StoryMap. And so that link is in the chat. Nikki hopefully put that link into the chat. So if you're having trouble accessing the StoryMap through Esri, you can find the link in the chat through the DNRC's website. And then, let's see, I have a couple of questions. So Joel, you mentioned you didn't have a comprehensive list of the stream gauges in geospatial format before you started this project. So what other sort of like gaps in data sets has this like led to you thinking about and sharing with the public or publishing on your website?
You know, it did highlight that there are some things that you would think that we would have, but we don't. And being able to see all this visually is a huge win. You know, it's just very intuitive and straightforward. And as far as, you know, maybe it hasn't been enough time, but I don't think I've got a good answer for you for one that, you know, something that made me think, oh, we need to get that up too. I'm sure there is, but put on the spot, I'm not sure I can think of one right now. In general, I think it was a good lesson that, yeah, we need to get up to date on some of our GIS is behind, you know, so.
And then I had another question about the funding of the gauges. So when there are these cooperative agreements with different groups, like funding different parts of it, like you mentioned that Fish and Wildlife will fund just the temperature part of the gauge. How do these agreements get worked out, and how do they change over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's something we've talked with our local USGS office about. And it goes back to that question. You've got all these different entities funding gauges, making decisions independently. But when one gauge goes off, I mean, DNRC, I only fund 43, but we rely on all 220. So if one goes out, just because I'm not funding it, doesn't mean it's not important to me. So USGS, our local office, so actually, they've hosted one meeting, and I believe they're going to be hosting another one. And we've been encouraging them to pull all the funders together at least once a year, so we can talk about different priorities and we can get a heads up of, you know, and I'll just speak from DNRC side. And I do have the conversation with my Fish, Wildlife, and Parks co-worker. Is we do talk every year about funding and how much you have to fund this year, and can you fund this gauge, or I'll fund that gauge, or how we might try to maximize our dollars so we're both our agencies, we're getting the most out of it. If that conversation could happen on a system-wide basis with all the different funders, but because it's USGS has the relationship with all of them, we've been working with them to try to pull something like that together on an annual basis to kind of help coordinate that a little bit. Yeah, because when BLM decides they're not going to fund a gauge, it affects more than just BLM. And knowing about that in advance with enough warning would give state agencies, watershed groups time to think about, okay, is this really important? If they're not going to fund it, is there another way we can keep this gauge going? Those conversations have increased the last couple of years, in large part thanks to working with our local USGS office about that. And so we, over the last, well, gosh, just the last couple of months, there were 4 gauges that we were going to lose. We managed to pull funding agreements together with different partners, in part because we had a lot of warning that it was going to happen. And it wasn't scrambling in the last 2 weeks. We had several months warning. So working the phones, working connections, we put funding together between DNRC, FWP, Salish Kootenai Tribe, and even Trout Unlimited. So that was very, very helpful for us.
All right, well, great. All right, well, thank you all so much for this presentation. I don't see any more questions coming in, and we are at the top of the hour. So if you have any final thoughts or last comments?
No, I just want to give a shout out. Well, first off, thank you for inviting us, and a shout out to our local Wyoming, Montana Water Science Center with USGS, and then all the watershed groups that helped with our stories and have been working with us on this. They've all been very helpful, and they're very appreciative of informing people about the importance of stream gauges.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much again. And thank you to everyone who attended. Check out the StoryMap. Check out all the work that the department is doing in Montana, and join our peer-to-peer network. You'll get more announcements about webinars like this one and more information about water data across the country. All right. Thank you, everyone.